crowned heads, wealth and privilege may well tremble should ever again the black and red unite. This is the words of Otto von Bismarck, the so-called Iron Chancellor, after the fall of the Paris Commune in the 1870s. And today we are going to be focusing on the idea of the Commune, particularly as it develops into the idea of the Workers' Council, and dare I say it, the Soviet. And today to discuss the Workers' Council, the Soviet, and indeed the future of revolution is Jasper Bernes, author of The Future of Revolution, Communist Prospects from the Paris Commune to the George Floyd Uprising. Jasper, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So just to start off, one of the really important things you highlight just in the beginning of the book is how with a lot of our concepts of revolutionary struggle, be it even the concept of revolution, I think concepts like communism, insurrection, especially the entire Marxist tradition, including many of the anarchist tradition that grew up alongside it or parallel to it. Only really of the 20th century have we had an actual sort of conceptual and practical innovation. And this is the formation of the idea of the Soviet, the Workers' Council. Could we sort of start by unpacking what it means to describe something as a Workers' Council? What does the concept of the Workers' Council mark? And what does it mean for it to be an example for practice in any ongoing revolutionary struggle?
That's a great question. So the Workers' Council emerges as an instrument of what Karl Kautsky and Rosa Luxemburg describe as the mass strike. So originally, it's a way for workers who have struck their workplaces or taken them over to coordinate their activity. And they can even coordinate it clandestinely through this structure. And what it involves is the kind of selection of delegates, right, who then meet together and carry explicit instructions from the kind of the base groups that elect them. And there's this kind of slippage within the notion of the Council of the Soviet. Sometimes it refers to this group of delegates, and sometimes it refers to the workers who have taken over their workplace, right? And so it's unclear sometimes what people mean when they say a workers' council. It can be both the kind of delegating body itself or the delegate. So, but as mass strikes transform into insurrections and as the armed power of the state is annulled, these councils then quickly become instruments for the socialization of wealth, for expropriation of the means of production. This is already ready to hand. Workers have taken over their workplaces, so they have a kind of tacit control over production. Trotsky says something really interesting in writing on the 1905 Russian Revolution, where the Soviets first emerge. And he says that when the Soviets are kind of managing the strike and they're shutting down production, at the same time, they are already taking it over because they need to keep certain vital services running, right? They may shut down most workplaces, but they manage to keep the lights on, right? They take over the newspapers, but they then use the newspapers to spread the news of the revolution. So they're already, as they're kind of shutting things down, also taking them over and socializing production. So, this passage from mass strike to revolution it is a fairly natural one. And, that's basically, the structure comes in some ways from the Paris Commune, in the sense that, the Commune, as Marx describes it, is, the form finally discovered in which to work out economical emancipation of the workers. And the Commune also had this delegate structure, right? That was how it was organized. And the Commune had this vision that structure, that form, could eventually expand and take over the entire world. And it would sort of trespass borders. It was essentially limitless because it had this kind of plasticity, right? It could adapt to different conditions, and you could have communes inside of communes. It's a kind of almost fractal structure, right? It has this kind of self-similarity at different levels. And so, Marx thought that was basically how communism would unfold was with some kind of form like that. And he seems to have been right, because in 1905 with the Russian Revolution, this thing appeared again. And it's not clear whether it was, explicitly modeled on the Paris Commune or people just kind of hit on it intuitively. There's different stories about the origins of the Soviet. But whereas the workers' councils are a little bit different is that the Paris Commune, had this delegate structure, but it wasn't specifically limited to workers, right? It was more of a kind of democratic structure that it would incorporate citizens or everyone, right? And so the councils are a bit different in that they limit participation to proletarians. So in Germany, for example, people had to show a work card demonstrating some history of proletarian labor, whether they were presently employed or not. And so there's this kind of proletarian restriction that gets added to the commune form by the workers' council. The other restriction that gets added is that, at least for some partisans of the councils are supposed to be explicitly communist. They're supposed to engage in the socialization of wealth and the construction of a common plan for common use. And that is part of the kind of ideal of the workers' council. In practice, they often were not explicitly communist or even explicitly proletarian. And so kind of people who are partisans of the council hope to reform and refound the councils in a kind of explicitly proletarian and communist manner.
Yeah, and there's particularly in terms of whether or not these workers' councils end up being communist, even in the case of the Paris Commune. I think one of the really interesting things you point out in the book is how, in a way, the Paris Commune wasn't communist in a way because it was Marxist, in the way Marx became a communard because he saw that this is a practical vehicle, not necessarily for his theory, but for what was already going on and simply what he might have needed to theorize on top of it, because there were, Blanquists and Proudhonists and Jacobins within the commune form. But speaking on the level of philosophy, one concept that really appears quite a lot in terms of where the commune, the Soviet, the council sort of rises and falls is its ability to sustain what you call a self-reflexive character, and as well a kind of a feedback mechanism of sorts between the sort of the not to be too liberal about sort of the demos and the power it constitutes. Not necessarily have to think about it in terms of constituent power. That's an Italian thing from way further down the line. But in terms of this concept of self-reflexivity, what does it mean for a Soviet, a workers' council, to be self-reflexive, and how is this so important for its sort of maintenance and self-reproduction?
That's a very good question. So I think this self-reflexivity is something that you can derive logically from the structure of the commune as Marx describes it, or at least the kind of ideal structure, right? These delegates are supposed to be mandated. They carry explicit instructions. So it's not like bourgeois representative democracy where you elect someone and they just kind of make whatever decisions, and you hope that those are decisions you agree with. They carry explicit instructions, and they're also revocable on demand, right? There are a few other things. They're supposed to kind of serve for just a short period of time so that there doesn't emerge a difference between, for example, a kind of class of delegates and bureaucrats and the workers themselves. The delegates are workers. They come from the workplace. And the sort of work of participating in these delegate structures is supposed to be simplified, right? So anybody can do it. So it doesn't belong to a kind of class of technicians. But if you think about this, if you think that the base associations of proletarians who nominate these delegates, if you think that they're essentially free associations, right? And they've annulled the police power of the state, then there really is no way for the delegates to kind of make a decision that the workers themselves don't agree with, right? And so they have to kind of bring the plans back to the proletariat and get their assent and their consensus. So there's a kind of reflexivity, there's a feedback mechanism because this kind of right to revoke exists explicitly or tacitly, right? Even if the delegates aren't formally revoked, if they do something that the workers themselves don't want to do, or if they come up with a plan that the workers themselves don't want to follow, then they just won't, because there's no power to compel them to do so. So it's very different than democracy as we conceive of it, as the kind of power of, the majority over everyone. That's not exactly how it functions. It requires a certain degree of unanimity and consent.
Yeah, and I think this kind of structure also permeated a little bit into sort of communist parliamentarianism, with the idea of like a workers MP or a workers representative for a workers wage, because otherwise, and I think social democrats are finding this out the hard way, otherwise, electing the workers supporting a certain representative just becomes, a popularity contest to determine who gets to make more money than the rest of them, and then so much money they no longer need reliance on the workers for their support. I mean, one of the other things this is, guess what, debate with Lenin and against people like Appel with the idea of left-wing communism being a kind of infantile disorder, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's James Carville's favorite communist bit of literature. But one of the things in terms of, I think this also comes up as well. We talk about the general sort of mass strike versus the general strike, where we're not pausing things so that our betters will run them better, rather than so we can take them over. One of the main obstacles to this, and this is one of the most interesting things about the historical conditions of possibility of something like a Soviet, is the Workers' Council has to suppress to the point eventually it can no longer serve as what it is, the standing army. Standing armies, of course, historically very rare. They're a very modern thing. I mean, Britain very much was not interested in having a standing army for a while previously. Listeners, it was mostly mercenary work. That was the real PMC back in the day. I mean, to this extent, how does the commune have to relate to the concept of armament in terms of expressing its force in relation to something like a standing army? Because it's easy to forget that the Paris Commune was a full siege. It was a full military. It was a civil war. I mean, that's as Marx and Engels noted.
Well, I think the first measure is to arm the proletariat. That's to say, to arm the people. And at the same time, a kind of frontal confrontation with the army is not likely to succeed. And so the way that the armed power of the state is annulled is usually through some process of mutiny and fraternization and a kind of splitting of different factions with the army against each other, so that you're just left with the kind of hardcore of special forces or whatnot. And so that's essentially the process that happens. Is there's a kind of suspension of the armed power of the state, and then a dispersion of that armed power throughout the entirety of the councils, right? It's not just some particular group that has a responsibility to defend the revolution. It's everyone. And by doing that, you prevent the kind of reconstitution of the state. But this is a process that happens by degrees. For example, in Germany, this was a revolution that was first and foremost an anti-war revolution. It began within the Navy when the German Navy tried to win a few battles right before they conducted their treaty, and essentially all the sailors mutinied and they formed councils. And then those councils then spread to the shipyards, which were proximate. And from there, they spread to the rest of Germany. And so in the German case, you had these soldiers' councils, and they were a power. And then you also had generals trying to reconstitute the army, and of course, bringing in mercenaries, these free militias, in order to fight against the revolution. So most revolutions are a situation where there's a kind of partial suspension of state power, and that needs to be actualized and extended. That's the task of the revolution, is to kind of fully suspend that state power, so that the property rights of the elites, the bourgeoisie, cannot be enforced. And so you can socialize everything. You can't socialize wealth if there's still an army and a police who are going to shoot you as you try to do it.
This is quite interesting because I have sort of two questions here. How does this relate to, especially when, you speak of the debate with Lassalle and the Social Democrats and the elimination or supersession of the bourgeois subject as the placeholder for a political actor. My question then becomes, what does proletarianization look like under the Workers' Council? Because, proletarianization in a capitalist mode of production has, let's say, a negative connotation, right? Proletarianization then becomes, it seems in the discussion we're having here, a kind of different form of, for lack of a better word, like walking into a political subject or becoming a political subject. And I was wondering if you could expound on that a little bit.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the classical conception coming from Marx is that proletarianization is this process of bringing everyone into the commune or the Workers' Council and making it so that everybody is responsible for the reproduction of society. But by doing that, you therefore eliminate the proletariat as a class. It abolishes itself. And so, it's not that other people can't participate, but they can't participate as property owners or as, petty bourgeois journalists. If they want to participate in the councils, they have to kind of participate as essentially propertyless and on the basis of communism. In doing that, you essentially abolish classes and all class society. Now, there's a criticism of council communism that says that it really wasn't about abolishing the proletarian condition, but in fact generalizing it. And it wanted to kind of create this society of workers who would essentially still be subordinated. And I do think that there's some truth to that. And it's something that needs to be considered. For example, the KPD, which was the German party that was council communist, one point in their program is, ruthless enforcement of the compulsion to work. And that does really sound like a kind of forced proletarianization of everyone that may not, in fact, overcome the proletarian condition or abolish proletarians as a class. I hope it's clear from my book that I don't agree with that. And I don't think it's really necessary, precisely because what I was saying about the kind of free character of these associations, right? When you don't have police power, you can't force people to do things. And so that has to be considered.
In terms of developing from this history of the KPD, one of the strands you really pick up on is this question of the Long 68, which is probably could have been another name for this podcast, the Long 68, to be honest. I mean, in terms of, the post, when there were sort of workers' councils being established in France during the revolutionary period, but nonetheless it was defeated, partially, due to the inaction of the reigning communist party, not the reigning communist party, but the dominant forces that called themselves communist or acted in sort of that more Marxist-Leninist traditional vein. And building on this critique of sort of the failures of the non-revolution of 68, the revolutionary non-revolution of 68, you develop on Gilles Dauvet and the concept of communization against an idea of the ultra-left. Where does this theory of communization come into it in terms of developing the idea of the commune beyond its kind of essentially recuperation into sort of Soviet models or the models of basically classic democratic representation?
Yeah, that's very important. So with communization, you get essentially a criticism of council communism that says these people didn't really want communism and they weren't aiming to achieve it, but what they were aiming for was a kind of self-managed capitalism, right? So this would be a kind of generalization of the proletarian condition that doesn't overcome it. I think that there's there's something important about this critique, but I also think it misses the mark in many ways. So this communization theory, and particularly Gilles Dauvet, they emerge out of what I call a council communist revival that begins after World War II. And, there are all kinds of groups, ultra-left groups who are defectors from Trotskyism or Maoism or this or that, Marxist-Leninism. And they all become really enamored with this idea of the Workers' Council. And then in 1956, you have the Hungarian Revolution, which was a councilor revolution. And this seems to confirm their ideas that this is the way forward, not just in the capitalist countries, but also in these actually existing socialist countries. And so you have this milieu that is broadly council communist, right? The Situationist International, for example, puts the Workers' Council at the center of their idea of communism. And so you have this council communist milieu, and then 1968 happens, and no one forms workers' councils. And even though there are many people clamoring for them, right? The workers, they strike their workplaces, they take them over, but they don't seem to have any desire to form these kinds of councils, right? And that has to do with what is sometimes called refusal of labor, right? Which is this new theme that emerges and that many communists see, which is that workers don't really identify with their workplaces in the same way. There's a kind of disidentification from the workers' movement. And essentially, what you see is that a lot of these workers don't really want to take over and run their factories. And this may have a lot to do with how labor has changed and transformed in late capitalism, and also the institutionalization of the workers' movement and its unions and parties, which was particularly strong in France, for example. And so that's where communization emerges, as a kind of critique of the idea of the Workers' Council on the part of people who had been true believers. And so they propose instead a kind of different vision of communism that wouldn't proceed necessarily through these kinds of councils and would sort of immediately socialize production. But what I think is that it's not clear that vision of communization is all that different ultimately from the councils. It may just be kind of re-emphasizing this proletarian and communist dimension that I've been talking about. And some of the criticisms that Dauvet and others develop of council communism had kind of already been anticipated by the council communists themselves. And so the debate between, on the one hand, communization theory, and on the other hand, council communism, is sort of people talking past each other and missing the mark, as is so often the case, especially among Marxists.
Yeah, I mean, thinking of something like, the ZAD in France as a form, it does feel like these it feels like the meme of like, these things broadly overlap, but the difference is important to some people, and that might be fair enough. I mean, in terms of the development away from sort of this, in a way, the split between the workers and, the communists, there's one really interesting thing here when you talk about, in a way, the distinction between the communist movement and the movement of communists. And it very much does center on the role of theory and the role of communist movements as essentially kind of memory banks for communist struggle, in order to try and develop that example through practice. And I would sort of ask, particularly about the role of theory and the role that communists play in workers' councils, even as their formation might not itself arise from a communist party or a communist organization.
So this is very much a live question, especially within council communism. Certain strains of council communism really tried to restrict the movement of communists, that's to say the movement of communist intellectuals, because they see this tendency for intellectuals to kind of assert leadership over a movement And for Council Communism, self-organization and kind of self-determination is the sine qua non of the unfolding of the Council or revolution. For the Council Communists, even the ones who had an idea of a party, the party was supposed to kind of abolish itself in the process of creating the councils. And then essentially, power is turned over to the vast majority. You no longer need a party. And the difference between communist intellectuals and communist workers has vanished, right? The movement of communists on the one hand, which is the kind of movement of people who are committed ideologically to communism, and then the communist movement on the other hand, which is the movement of producing communism. In revolutionary moments, those two things converge, right? But in non-revolutionary moments, they diverge. And so there's always this question, which is, what do you do, right? If you write a book like mine, you're largely going to be read by other communists, right? And they want to know, what should I do? What can I do? And the answer may be not much, right? That's sort of been the answer that Council Communists have given. But there's also this sense that that this kind of intellectual layer needs to restrict itself or abolish itself, or that even the role of communist intellectuals or explicit partisans is to fight all the other partisans who are trying to kind of establish leadership over the revolution. And it's as if they imagine that during a revolution, there won't be people who are passionately committed to communism and to making it happen. I just think that's wrong. There's always going to be this process of what I call partisanization, right? Whether it involves a formal party or not, there was always going to be some layer who is, dedicated to the revolution and wants to see it succeed. And those people are going to do something. So the question is, what is it that you think they should do? Because you're not going to convince them to do nothing, especially, when death is at the door, when the stakes are life or death. You're not going to convince people to kind of restrict themselves in this way. So this is one of the things that communization theory is good about, especially Gilles Daudet. He sort of answers this question, and he seems to think of it as a non-problem, because in a revolutionary moment, this intellectual layer essentially dissolves, right, and merges with everyone else, and it's no longer a problem. It's simply part of the process of generalizing communism, which is going to involve some people who are voluntarist, who are adventurist, right? Who are doing things not just out of self-interest, which is probably the motivation of most people. You need to speak to their self-interest for their life to get better if you want to generalize communism. But some other people don't have those motivations. They're passionately, ideologically committed to communism. They're fanatics, and they're going to do something. So instead of trying to imagine some state of affairs in which they do nothing, I think it's better to imagine what that group might do that is useful.
Yeah, in my experience with sort of Marxist, sort of socialist, communist organizations, it's almost like at this point, I'm like, okay, we don't need to be the party that vanguards things. If anything, we kind of need to be almost like, a memory bank, a space for workers' inquiry, but ultimately kind of like roadies for communism. Put the band's already on tour, so to speak. I mean, when it comes to the negative concept of the movement, I also really appreciate how you stick with the German ideology definition of communism, that it is the movement that abolishes the present state of things, which I still think is I agree with you, it's probably the most radical definition of communism ever put forward. And indeed, it's one that comes from them when they're engaging with the challenge of Stirnerism, and sort of, okay, well, how do we fulfill people's self-interest through communism in a way that doesn't make them simply individuals, but actually fulfills them through self-abolition? And I just wanted to read out just a quote from the book itself, because I think it's just a beautiful manifesto for people to hear, which is: the first task for the movement of communists is to observe present struggles, their own and those proximate, first and foremost, to reflect them critically, which is to say, from the standpoint of communism and its logical contours. Lenin's newspaper as party is an organizational cliche. but it rests upon the truism that every communist organization is a medium of communication for action. This is true of the anti-Leninist correspondence committees of the Council of Communist Revival as well. The difference is that, in the latter case, these networks are not places simply for the consolidation of a hegemonic leadership, but for the critical proliferation of struggle, the clarification of which will reveal communist consensus as it exists. The goal is not to lead a movement or simply to expand it, but to facilitate the spread of revolutionary examples chosen by struggle itself. And with that, I really want to just ask another question. Sorry, Will, I'm hogging a little bit, just about the Johnson-Forrest tendency and sort of the role of the developing concept of workers' inquiry. Because at least in sort of the spaces that I'm in, this stuff is really picking up steam as a concept that more and more organizations are doing.
Absolutely. One of the things that I try to do in this book is to describe something which I call the ultra-left, which might in some ways be a fiction, right? The term ultra-left was originally a Leninist pejorative, right? Which just referred to everybody who was left of the Bolsheviks. And then Gilles Daudet, when he develops his critique from the standpoint of communization, he uses the term ultra-left to kind of refer to council communists critically. But I would argue that communization is nonetheless still a part of that ultra-left because it shares certain key presuppositions with council communism. And we might say the same of, autonomous Marxism in Italy, at least in its, least Leninist variations. We could say the same thing of, Abolition today. And so there is this kind of broad milieu, which we can call ultra-left, which is really distinct. And what this milieu does well is paying attention to what's happening in the world, right? And the theme of third workers' inquiry is one form of this. It's something that emerges with the council communist revival. It's not really something you find in historical council communism, but when council communism returns after World War II, it is often accompanied with this idea of inquiry, which I argue comes from the Johnson-Forrest tendency of C.L.R. James and Raya Junevskaya and Grace Lee Boggs, who conduct these workers' inquiries. And the goal is to discover the real kind of motivations of workers themselves and to figure out what they're doing, how they are struggling, and to broadcast those new forms of struggle, to share them with other workers in other places. And that's an idea of what it is that communists can do. They can broadcast and reflect and transmit and amplify these practices. And that becomes, part of the idea of organization for certain groups within this council communist revival. For example, ECO, which conceives of its organization as simply a kind of network of different proletarians in struggle. It becomes the mail carrier of the proletariat, shuttling messages back and forth between different groups of self-organizing proletarians. And that idea is still really potent. And if you look at groups who descend in one way or another from this milieu, whether we're talking about EndNotes or the Brooklyn Rail or Notes from Below or what have you, these are basically the only places where you can find anyone paying attention to what proletarians are doing. And, if you want to learn about the George Floyd Uprising or what's happening in Turkey right now, or if you want to kind of read about struggles, about how proletarians are resisting, you really can't find this stuff anywhere else. No one else is really paying attention. And that's the real strength of this milieu, because it refuses this kind of idea of, hey, we're going to organize the class, we're going to lead them, we're going to educate them. I think it's a lot better at paying attention and seeing what's there. And so, most of the best analyses, for example, of the George Floyd Uprising, come from this broad milieu. And outside of that, you see people saying almost nothing. There's a total kind of lack of interest in learning about these things and learning what people are doing on the part of, for example, the kind of the socialist revival, the democratic socialist revival, people in the DSA, they just aren't really interested in that. And so I kind of expand this idea of inquiry to include workers' inquiry, but also to go beyond it. And I refer to what I call struggle inquiry, right? Writing about existing struggles, understanding their tactics and their strategies, and basically thinking about what the limits are that they encountered, right? So a kind of critical reflection. And then there's another area that I think lots of people are already starting to work on, which is what I call technical inquiry, which is an investigation of the material and technological character of capitalist reproduction, right? So that we understand how capitalism functions, where the water comes from, how electricity is generated, where food comes from in your area. And so that we gather knowledge that is going to be useful and in fact necessary during a revolution. This is information that will need to be collected one way or another. So we might as well try to start now, because if you want to expropriate the means of production, if you want to socialize wealth, you need to understand what it is. You can't expropriate it if you don't know anything about it, right? And also, we're not trying to take over existing means of production and use them in the same way they've always been used. In fact, we'll probably want to change what they do. And in order to do that, we need to understand sort of what these technologies are and how they can be changed. Maybe they can't. Maybe we just need to kind of destroy them. And so we need to be able to kind of identify what possibilities exist given the technical repertoire that we have. And so this requires kind of description, paying attention to what's out there, but also imagination and speculation, and kind of engineering consciousness that can imagine these means of production being transformed.
One of the things coming out of the George Floyd uprising, there were several essays that that struck a tone that seems to fall back into a kind of Marxian criticism of adventurism. One of the essays, at least put out in endnotes, found itself under that kind of criticism. I'm wondering, do you have a concern that, the way in which workers' councils, not necessarily in the SI or in Debord's work, but today, especially in a counterinsurgent moment, because that's what we're living in. We are living a really long counterinsurgency now, and one that's worsened after George Floyd. Which I really think is a hinge point. That up front, the concerns of the council is, how do we replicate the functions of policing without the police? To me, this seems very similar to the kinds of things that Lazzarato was saying in the 90s, that Paulo Verno was trying to say, that in fact the Negriists are doing with the notion of institution. If abolition is something that is formalized and institutionalized, even if it's diffuse and mobile, if the notion of the security of the population is at the front end of the insertion of the Workers' Council in the so-called moment after the revolution, don't we run the risk of demanding a kind of vanguardism that only those with technical knowledge can provide input? B, that the definition of the worker is to be one that is stable and policed, and C, that the revolution immediately has to proliferate enemies. I'm wondering if that's a concern that contemporary council communists are kind of navigating.
I think that's very insightful, and I do think that that's an issue, right? Abolition, really means communism, right? You can't abolish the police without abolishing capitalism, which requires policing. And so I think the goal of an abolition committee, as I describe it, or the goal of that movement, is to make that fact clear, right? You can't just replace the police in this little area where people are incredibly desperate and there's all this interpersonal conflict essentially caused by capitalism and hope to be able to deal with that. That's not going to happen. So it's really not just about abolishing the police and, replacing them with militias or neighborhood safety committees. I completely agree with that. But if you talk to some abolitionists, there's an awareness of this. They'll say, abolition means food security. Abolition means giving people housing. Abolition means meeting people's needs for care of all kinds. And so my sense is that is what would have needed to happen. And that there was one vision of the movement, which did conceive of things in a kind of purely military fashion, right? If we think of the revolutionary example of the George Floyd Uprising being the burning of the third precinct, there was maybe an idea that all we need to do is just burn more police stations. And I hope it's clear from my book, but I don't think that would succeed. That would just kind of lead to this civil war in which you would have an increasingly kind of specialized and professionalized militias. And it's likely that our side would simply lose, right? Because the force of arms on the other side is so much stronger. So that's not the way to go. And that's clearly not what I'm saying. In fact, what I'm saying is that the kind of formation of these committees, which could start to really meet people's actual needs when police power has been partially suspended, that is what would allow the movement to grow and to avoid this kind of civil war scenario, which just would lead to chaos and would probably alienate many people who want their lives to get better and who don't want, and for whom safety and security is a major concern, right? They may hate the police, but they also don't want to just be living in this situation of constant violence, right? So you have to kind of meet those real needs and avoid, this kind of militarization of the conflict. It's not a purely military question. It's not simply a question of arms.
Yeah, I mean, so recently my good comrade Billy Cashmore has written an article about the ongoing sort of trans struggle. And one of the things she cites in that essay is a moment where J. Edgar Hoover decides that the Black Panthers are the most dangerous threat to the United States. And it's not when they're policing the police, it's when they start giving out free school breakfasts, which might indeed enact the program of abolition before it even got to the point of violence. And when it turns into a critique of, so-called adventurism or just any kind of insurrectionary violence, there is some, at least relative truth to the extent that, if you want to do an imminent critique of the Second Amendment, it wasn't there to keep a latent revolutionary mass potential. No, actually, all it has done, all it will do is create a permanent Freikorps, a permanent reserve Freikorps, which we're seeing now in the way that, for example, I can't remember what they're called now, like something stupid, Victory Patriots, whatever the fuck they're called, who have been
the Oath
tagging...
Keepers?
No, not the Oath Keepers. It's a different fascist militia with typical American extravagance. There's about 40 of them, but the one that was deputized, quasi-deputized for an ICE raids, and then one of them got a picture taken of him. I can't remember this. I think it's not Patriotic Front. That's a British fascist group. But way too many. There's too many Freikorps. Read further light and act accordingly. But when it comes to this question of the abolition committee, analysis of the George Floyd Uprising, what I find really interesting is the discussion of the tactic of arson, of the use of fire. Because when it comes to thinking about the Commune or the Soviet or the Workers' Council, the abolition committee, the big thing is that, well, they only had to fight one army in Paris and they lost. Since Robert Peel in sort of the UK and its exportation as a model, the police is an occupying army. And I still think I still finding out how many new armed law enforcement divisions the American state has. There's a post office like special service. I mean,
that's true. The oldest. That's the oldest armed force in the United States.
Probably
that was one of the first police forces created, the postal inspectors.
I mean, in terms of the confrontation with the police, and of course, given the political situation in the States, we can cut as much of this out if you given, they're now arresting judges and drawing up even more lists with their help of their friends at Palantir. When it comes to the idea of fire and sort of the response to the police, in terms of primarily, not in terms of this, abstract negation of, oh yes, people, they just killed all the police. Of course they didn't. There was a matter of demobilizing, and in a way, demobilizing the occupying army. How do you analyze the George Floyd Uprising in terms of these new tactics of demobilization, and in a way presenting us with this shadow of a new model of the Soviet in the form of the Abolition Committee?
Well, there's a number of different questions rolled together there. I'm not sure if people who were burning things down during the George Floyd Uprising really were strategically doing it in order to immobilize the police, but that's what it effectively did. And so what you saw is that after people would loot a store, they would burn it down. And this is really common. That's not specific to this uprising. The same thing happened in LA in 1992. And that's because looting is not just about sort of meeting needs, but it's also about people demonstrating their superiority over commodity society and the commodity form. This is something that Guy Debord says in writing about the Watts riot, and I think it's very perceptive, right? People love to just destroy the commodities, not just consume them, because they want to show that they're no longer kind of beholden to this society in which you need to work in order to earn money, in order to buy the things that you need. But effectively, what you saw in most cities is that fire immobilized the police, right? They attempted to kind of police the looting in many cities, but once things started to burn, the police instead fell back to and focused on escorting firefighters, and this meant that their power had been annulled, right? They were no longer able to enforce the property rights of property owners, and people could kind of loot with impunity and do so in increasingly sophisticated ways. That only lasts for a few days. Eventually, the National Guard comes in, and that's a very different animal. And so you have to think about how you could kind of extend the uprising once the National Guard has come in. And that's where I come up with this idea of the Abolition Committee. I mean, one idea would be that we form these kind of guerrilla units and go full civil war. But I think without something else, that's not likely to succeed. And so that's why I think, there was attempts to kind of take space and to form places where people could gather and could coordinate and could kind of extend the rupture. In some places, they did very interesting things. They put people in Minneapolis. They took over a hotel and gave people housing. There were kind of depots where looted goods could be distributed. And I think that those are the kinds of things that you would need to see more of. However, you do have to deal with the fact that in the United States, these were situations in which there were, dozens of different armed groups with different kinds of motives. And it was very, very complex and, in fact, terrifying for many people. And so, there has to be some way of figuring out how to deal with that situation. And so my idea is this Abolition Committee, which would really allow people to think about what would it mean to abolish the police. And of course, to realize that in order to abolish the police, you have to abolish capitalism, which is what makes the police necessary. And so those abolition committees would be, more or less councils for our time. And they would have to meet people's needs in order to, avoid the kinds of interpersonal conflicts that emerge. And they would probably have to develop kind of new ethics and new ways of kind of relating to social problems. And, I don't know exactly what that process looks like. In the United States, when you have this uprising and you suspend the power of the police, all this stuff comes to the surface. You see all of the violence of our society and the deprivation, and a lot of problems immediately present themselves. But these aren't problems we can go around. They have to be confronted head on. And so that's essentially my claim, right? But I'm definitely not saying the abolition committees would only focus on the armed power of the police, or that they would attempt to just kind of replace it. In fact, I think that this was the problem, is that you had a lot of these militias who were on the side of the movement, but they kind of appointed themselves as the leaders, right? And that's very problematic. You had all these people running around with guns and telling people what to do. So the abolition committee would be a way of avoiding that kind of scenario, where some group of people who have guns can just say, like, okay, we're in charge.
Yeah, I just wanted to swing back to the notion of technical inquiry, because I think that this might have a deeper historical presence. I'm wondering, what you think about technical inquiry from the side of those experiencing or deeply entrenched within any given struggle. So like the Socialist Patient Collective, the GIS, the GIP, run by Foucault, Deleuze, and others. Even just like Foucault's Discipline and Punish, right? These are texts with a kind of technical prowess, or even just like the letters of the Northern Luddites too, where a kind of technical expertise is inverted to try to point towards a way out, to sort of to render unnecessary, or at least to look at how history has demanded certain things be necessary. And I'm wondering if technical inquiry would require not just a kind of gathering up of intellectuals or of electricians, but also a historical disposition regarding these, for lack of a better word, institutions or modes of organization, that it might need a sort of either like a genealogical or archaeological bent as well.
Yeah, I like that. I like what you're saying. I want to be clear that I don't think that technical inquiry would be something conducted necessarily by some kind of small body of experts. In fact, to succeed, I think it would need to involve many, many people, and especially the people who rely on whatever it is you're inquiring about. So, for example, if we're talking about hospitals, right, you would want to talk to the patients themselves. That would be a part of the inquiry. And you would want them to be involved in the process of gathering the information. And absolutely, we would want to probably understand some of the genealogy of these institutions in order to transform them and to know what other possibilities there are. So in some cases, yeah, I think that kind of genealogical work could be very, very useful. This technical inquiry is absolutely not my idea. It's something that I've heard people talking about for about 15 years now. And there are different groups working on it. So one group that I'm in contact with is actually started with a hospital, and that they're kind of mapping the forces of production from the standpoint of this hospital and understanding who uses it, how it functions. And the goal is not just to take the hospital over, but obviously to kind of improve healthcare under some situation in which we're going to have a massive need for care of all sorts, and we're going to need to do it differently. And so how is that going to function? We're going to need the resources that hospitals have, but we're probably going to have to transform how they function. This is certainly true with mental health. My vision of revolution is one in which, because society is so productive, it's going to free up a lot of time. And mostly we're all just psychoanalyzing each other and helping each other overcome the traumas of the revolution and of our lives under capitalism. And we would be able to do that because we'd have time, right? Imagine if, 1 out of every 4 people was an analyst, and that's probably about how many analysts we're going to need, right? That's my sense, is that, in our society, care, because it's a service, becomes increasingly expensive, right? Education is expensive. Healthcare is expensive. Childcare is out of control expensive in the United States, where there's no socialization of it. Elder care is a nightmare. And, these are places where old people are being abused and neglected. And that's because manufacturing gets so much cheaper that these things relatively become more expensive. But what that means is that we as a society have time to provide this kind of care. We just don't, right? So probably what communism is going to look like is that most of us are going to be doing care work, right? That's going to be most of what it involves, is taking care of kids and old people and providing healthcare of all sorts, right? There's a massive need for it. And so, and we're going to have to provide it at a level far beyond what we do now. And we may have to do it with certain scarcities or shortages. Maybe we won't have certain drugs and we may have to do it differently. Or we, find out that there are new methods that are more effective. So I think the genealogical work could be useful in order to know how to dismantle these things. The genealogy is part of what they are, but, it wouldn't be genealogy for its own sake.
Yeah, and in terms of I think you're right that any future common society would both have to put everything into social reproduction, because in terms of the paradigm of where capital is heading now, I mean, since 2008, all Western, all sort of capitalist nations have had austerity, but especially with what's coming in the States now, and what is being amplified as more in places like Britain, is more or less just the management of surplus populations, and it's almost like a technical inquiry in the inverse, where they figure out what you need so specifically they can deny it to you. That is exactly the case in the care system in the UK. And it is a problem of labour ultimately, because whilst, even if we could transfer the wealth downwards, and that's not happening extra institutionally, may I say, transfer wealth downwards, it's still a matter of financing labour, and what labour is there? It's mostly just essentially more stolen from other nations. And then if you want to go into technical inquiry and think about the hot new technology, which everyone is kind of, just going nuts over, which is so-called artificial intelligence. I mean, if you want to do technical inquiry on that, you don't go to California, you go to Kenya, you go to a refugee camp, and you look at the people who are doing the micro work, just labeling those bits of information. I mean, part of the reason why the micro work is done under, within fenced camps is precisely so that we can't. But so, yeah, and I think, and also just another comment just quickly on the Abolition Committee. I'm always tempted to do a kind of a vulgar Hegelianism on it and just say that in a way, this is kind of the in itself of the Workers' Council, the communist movement becoming for itself. Finally, we have the movement to abolish the order of things, finally fully explicit. So I think it is a really brilliant formulation. Just one final question before we round off is, there's kind of an ongoing debate throughout the last few years on this podcast between two different positions, really, which is it's very much in the sort of Italian, very much in sort of also in sort of post-autonomist, very much sort of end note space, ill will kind of space, between the relation of insurgent or revolutionary power to institutions. This is a sort of debate between sort of destituent or deinstitutionalizing power and sort of constituent or institutionalizing power. And then, of course, there's a third term showing up in works, people like Norman Najari, instituent power. But let's keep a relatively practical binary just for now. I mean, what do you see as the relation of the contemporary sort of shadow contemporary forms of a potential Sovietization, communization to the role of institutions? Is it a role of taking them over primarily in terms of they currently exist, or do you think that the move currently is towards, a delinking from them in order to, essentially draining the labor power from institutions in order to destroy them without putting them back up? Do you think this is a post-revolutionary measure and we should sort of pause it for now and be just,
That's a great question. And I'm not sure that it can be answered in the abstract, right? Most of what is organized under the state will need to be abolished. It has no function aside from reproducing capitalism. At the same time, there may be aspects, for example, of the post office that would be useful. I don't think in any way we would retain these institutions, but we may retain aspects of them in order to transform them. And I do think that what I'm talking about is destitution, as long as we don't think of destitution as this kind of almost metaphysical process in which no one does anything and never organizes themselves into, into some form. I do insist on what I call a kind of common plan for common production, for common use. So maybe some people would think that's too constitutive. But I think that what I've said about freedom and about the kind of revocability of any kind of delegate or any process of coordination, I think that that's consistent with the notion of destitution. It is a kind of, destituting of these institutions. And the problem with historical council communism, when it confronted these problems, right? It wasn't the council communists themselves, but other people who were using the councils in order to reform the state, was that the councils essentially became a constitutive power. They became a constituent assembly, right? This is what happened, is that the councils formed across the entirety of the German nation. There was a kind of meeting called for a certain day in which everyone in Berlin was to kind of send their delegate. And when everyone showed up, many of the delegates weren't workers, and they were often kind of party officials or union officials. And they essentially voted to reconstitute the German state, to hold a meeting in which the councils would elect a constituent assembly. And that's the death of, that was, described as essentially a vote for suicide. So I think that I really am against, constituted power and a notion of the councils as a kind of constituent assembly. I think that that's the real danger. It was the real danger then, and I also think it's the real danger now. And you see it. You see this turn towards constitution within the movements of the last 15 years. For example, the estallido social in Chile, in which you had these assemblies, and what they eventually decided to do was to kind of, elect people to form a new constitution. That is the problem with constituent and constituted power. And it's a mistake. And I think that that's a real tendency at the moment, is to hope to kind of reconstitute or reform the state. And I think it's a trap. When I try to think about what direction the George Floyd uprising could have gone, one possible direction is that people would have tried to turn it into a movement for a constitutional amendment that would, put in the Constitution, something about anti-Black racism and reparations, and try to kind of essentially constitutionalize the demands of the movement. And I think that would both not work, and it would likely get the movement kind of bound up with the gears and wheels of the state in a way that would not be to its benefit. And you see the same thing in the Gilets Jaunes movement. They also kind of went in this direction of coming up with a constitution. So I'm actually really against this Hart and Negri idea of we need to be Jeffersonian and write a new constitution. I think that that's a real mistake.
Yeah, which would be in a way sort of destitutionalists of the intellect, but maybe and communizers of the will.
I mean, I'm not sure I understand what destitution means still. I read this stuff, I read Agamben and I just don't understand it. I read people, I think, Idris's piece was the best on it. And it started to make sense when reading that. And it essentially just means communism, right?
Yeah.
In that reading, it's just communism, in which case, yeah, then I'm for destitution.
Yeah. For anyone looking at destitution, Idris Robinson co-edited an issue of, I can't remember the name of the journal, but it's the first. It's
South
the
Atlantic,
South Atlantic Quarterly.
Yeah.
Yes, it's the only issue of any journal to get dedicated to the notion of destituency. That or just get on Ill Will's mailing list. But rather than just plug Ill Will and Idris Robinson, the book The Future of Revolution is out now. Is that now? You can get it from Verso. They have always got a sale on. Verso, as on this podcast, we have found out through pretty bad experience, not every left publisher is a comrade. Verso fucking are. Well, that's not just because I sent them a CV today. It is out now from Verso. Jasper, where can people find you if you'd like to be found online? Any place where people can send in further questions? Do you have any other events coming up people can attend?
So I'm on Twitter as Outside Agitator. It's really easy to find my email, and I like it when people write me. I do have some events coming up. I'm going down to LA next week, and I'm going to do an event on May 2nd at UC Irvine. And then I will do another event on May 3rd in town at this place called 2220 Arts and Archives. I think that's the right name. And then at the end of the month of May, I'm going to go up to Seattle to do a couple events for Red May, which is, an institution I've been connected with. They hosted a reading group and a kind of lecture series that I used to develop this book. So I sort of wrote this book with and through them. So it's really going to be nice to go up and do this event. Aegis Robinson is going to come out, and we are going to do an event together, maybe about the 5-year anniversary of the George Floyd Uprising. So I'm really looking forward to that. And then if you're in the Bay Area on June 7th, I will do a talk at Seeing Red, which is a great lecture series out here that you can find on Instagram.
Fantastic. Folks, this has been Acid Horizon, the Theory podcast, and cheers for listening. We'll catch you next time.